Fantastic. Who among you has used some open source software? Show of hands. That's awesome. Everyone's hand should actually be up, but that's okay. Now, how about some people who has contributed something to open source? That's awesome. That's pretty good. Fantastic. All right, great. So today we're going to look at being part of something bigger. So being part of an open source community and making a real difference with software. So have you ever thought about potentially working with some of the world's biggest open source software teams? Maybe you've wanted to expand your skill set and open up new opportunities. Maybe you want to create a dynamic portfolio of your work to show future employers and open up new opportunities. Maybe you just want to make a real difference to real-world projects, for instance. Or maybe from an IT business perspective, you actually want to improve the solutions that you're offering. Today, we're going to look at open source and see what this can do for us. So quick about me. I'm a 2008 IT Honours graduate, graduated here at JCU. I'm now working for the JCU eResearch Centre, primarily to do with development and operations, so a term called DevOps, mainly to do with research support. And I primarily work with open source software and love it every day. I work with web frameworks, libraries, different tools, servers, operating systems, you name it, I'll work with it. And you're about to learn today why I believe that open source is the future. It's the current, and put simply, it's awesome. So putting this talk together, I try to surmise, what open source sort of represents to different people. And unfortunately, I can't take credit for this graphic. It's fantastic, but it's fairly indicative of what I think a lot of people think about open source. And so the bottom one at the right-hand side was me last night preparing these slides. But what is open source? So for those of you who don't know, well, open source, it's a development process that involves openly sharing code, not just code, but openly sharing ideas and blueprints. It doesn't necessarily have to be just software, anything can be open sourced, but the main idea behind open source is that content is freely licensed. It means it's free in terms of speech. In terms of software, just because something's free, like iOS or iTunes, doesn't make it open source. From a development point of view, this means that as a developer, you're making your code available for reuse and you're making it open and accessible. And from a user's point of view, this means you can download the code, access it, and change it freely and without restrictions. And you're able to do that. And from a community point of view, an open source community effectively bonds the community together over some software in order to fix issues and actually develop new features. But who's using open source? I know some people said before. Well, realistically, oops. Okay, it's not here. It'll just appear. Anyway, all sorts of people use open source. Every one of you here, who's loaded a web page today? Yeah, everybody? Then it's almost certain that you've used open source because 82% of the web content that's available at the moment is served either through an open source web server or using an open source actual technology. So effectively, yes, everyone uses open source, even Windows users. And an interesting statistic is that this year in 2014, a survey of 1,200 IT professionals actually were determined that they would actually expected to contribute and adopt open source in their enterprise. But the question is, sort of, why are they doing this? Well, that same survey went through a number of different aspects, and in surveying these professionals found out that it's everything from cost in terms of maintenance and upfront cost as well. The products that are available open source tend to be high quality. You've got the freedom to change code and add features as you need to. You've got, in addition to that, you've also got security. So improvements in security because people can actually see the code. And because the technologies are open, you're not tied to one specific company delivering you updates and so forth. And effectively, you've got a wider skill base that you can tap into. That image at the bottom there's a bit cut off, but you get the idea anyway. And yeah, so effectively these benefits show because all sorts of closed source systems actually build on open source. So everything from iOS to Mac OS X, Windows, sort of, to Twitter, Facebook, Windows Azure, all of these different platforms use open source in their offerings. So awesome, you might say. That's fantastic. But how does this actually benefit me? Well, here's a bit of an insight for you. So what do you call a Linux volunteer who's just contributed his or her 6th patch to the Linux kernel? Well, the answer is hired. And the in-joke is that after you've contributed 5 patches, you'll be offered a job immediately by some company that's out there. And it's interesting to note that this is actually from Information Week. So it shows that open source is in use, in demand, especially from a corporate perspective. So open source will open opportunities for you. So in all sorts of different areas, from jobs and employment, because employers want to see what you've done. Your code contributions are public, and that means people can see them. You can give the employer your GitHub URL, which I'll talk about in a moment. In terms of knowledge and skills, you'll learn by doing on real-world projects. By getting involved, you'll learn everything from industry best practice through negotiation skills with people. In terms of minimising effort, you'll end up saving time, money, and effectively you're able to do lots of different things that you wouldn't be able to do before because you're not reinventing the wheel. And from something that's really important from my perspective is that you can connect with the world at large. So for me, I tend to work here alone, sort of just by myself. I'm working here in an office in Townsville. Sort of couldn't be more far removed from somewhere like Silicon Valley. But realistically, I'm actually part of all of these huge software teams that are out there in the world. And I'm actually part of somebody else's team, they're part of my team. I probably don't even know exactly where my code's being used at the moment. So it's an interesting feeling to think that I'm making a difference and I may not even know. And so effectively about making a difference, the open source community is extremely passionate, and to a lot of people it's more than just a job because it's actually something they tend to care really deeply about. But what about getting started? So in order to get started, it's pretty simple. Go ahead, create some profiles for yourself on the open source code hosting platforms GitHub, Bitbucket. They're the 2 biggest ones at the moment. Embrace version control around the code that you're developing, and there's plenty of tutorials out there if you're not doing it already. Effectively, its importance can't sort of be overstated. You can definitely think about releasing your code to the world. If it's helped you, it'll help other people. You don't have to market your code. People will find you. It does happen. In doing so, with using open source, you can leverage other people's projects. So if you're working on something with a Raspberry Pi, for instance, you'll be using open source code already. So look for that open source code. Look for that open source code, and you'll be able to reuse it and potentially be able to contribute back to it as well, whether that be bug fixes, extra code, extra features, and stuff like that as well. You can also think about attending conferences and user groups. Most of them tend to be in major cities around Australia, but it's not too hard to get to. And there's plenty more room to grow for regional centres like here in Townsville and Cairns. And effectively, the long story short is be open to new ideas. More or less, we all can't know everything, so there's always room to learn. But how about some myths? So, first myth is that I can't help myself. I can't help on an open source project. Well, realistically, it's not all just about programming. Anyone can contribute documentation fixes or correct spelling mistakes. Second myth is I can do it all myself. Well, sure, you could if your name is Google and you've got millions of dollars behind you. If anyone's got that sort of money, then I'm happy to implement code for you. Another myth is that open source isn't safe. Well, realistically, by opening the code up, more eyes on the code means that there's more chance that issues are going to be picked up and security issues will be closed. The communities tend to have a responsible disclosure framework around reporting security issues and tend to be a lot more receptive, in my experience, than commercial providers. Other thoughts are, well, I can't get support. There's a community out there that can help you on effectively every project. Wider skill bases mean you can get support in all these different channels, whether it be through email, IRC, Stack Overflow, all of these different channels are available that you can get support on. The common misconception that there's no money to be made, well, you can do everything from selling development to delivering a software as a service and selling services to enterprise. The similar notion is that closed source is potentially cheaper. Well, realistically, what's the price of freedom? Imagine if your one company that you're receiving a service from disappears tomorrow. If it disappears, then what are you going to do? Do you have a backup plan? If it's open source, you can either maintain it yourself or move on to some other company who's already providing that open source software. And finally, the last myth is that I can't work in a regional area. Well, open source is everywhere, much like the internet is everywhere. And companies will absolutely hire remotely. So to all of that, I say, myth busted. So get started now. It's incredibly easy. For IT professionals, go ahead, contribute in any way you can, build your profile, and effectively from industry perspective, recognise the benefits of open source. It's an incredible movement. People are using it right now. And effectively go forth, make a difference. Thanks.
Do you have any questions for David? That's great. We clap in Townsville and Cairns just keep on clapping.
Come on, I've got to be a question. No, nothing? It's fantastic.
What's the best way to actually break into these communities is from someone just looking up especially one of the big ones like Linux, Red Hat, or all those type of things.
Yep.
And kind of go, all right, I want to contribute something.
Yep.
Who am I as a guy at university? Just how do you actually go? All right.
How do you get started?
I want to contribute this code.
Yep. Great question. The best way I sort of found is by using. I tend to contribute to projects that I actually do use and actually take a real interest in. So, for instance, the computer, the Mac here, is not actually running Mac OS X, it's running Ubuntu. And if I find issues with that, I will tend to report them. So more or less, I'm already getting a benefit out of using the computer, and therefore if I find an issue, I can report it back. And as sort of part of that, then if I think there's a feature that's missing or something like that, I could potentially look at adding it or supporting somebody else and saying, hey, I think that feature would be great too, looking at the bug reports that are out there. But yeah, more or less just getting involved by using those products and stuff like that too. So hypothetically, if it's like I was giving the example before of a Raspberry Pi, if you download the open source libraries for communicating with one of its ports, you find a bug in that, report an issue, report some code back. That's the best way to get involved with it, and that's sort of where you can start and where you end up, anywhere you want to be.
Question from Luke.
Same question.
Yeah.
Any questions from Cairns?
Yeah, any questions?
No worries. Don't be shy about asking questions because we've got to keep moving. So let's thank David again and we'll invite Luke and Tom down.